I stared at the legal document in my hands, each word hitting like shrapnel to the chest. Jennifer Marie Caldwell, defendant, is hereby sued for ungratefulness, emotional distress, and failure to honor parental sacrifice. My own parents were taking me to court because I refused to hand over my military pension and savings to fund their retirement cruise around Europe. The same parents who had treated me like unpaid farm labor for 18 years, who never once asked about my 3 tours in Afghanistan, who told me I was wasting my life when I enlisted. Well, Mom and Dad, if we're talking about legal battles, let's talk about the $847,000 you owe me in back wages. At 42, I thought I'd seen everything. Roadside bombs in Kandahar, helicopter crashes in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, watching good soldiers come home in boxes while their families wept into folded flags. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for opening my mailbox last Tuesday to find a summons from Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, the most expensive law firm in Millfield County, Tennessee. The return address made my stomach drop. I knew exactly who had hired them. The lawsuit claimed I was an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned family obligations despite receiving substantial parental investment throughout childhood. They were seeking $200,000 in damages for emotional distress, plus another $150,000 for what they called anticipated future support that was wrongfully withheld due to defendant's selfish military career. Reading those words felt like getting hit by an IED all over again. They were actually trying to bill me for raising me, as if love and care were business transactions with interest rates attached. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since the news broke in our small town. Millfield only had 12,000 people, and everybody knew everybody's business. The local newspaper, the Millfield Gazette, had somehow gotten hold of the story and ran it with the headline, "Local Veterans Sued by Parents for Ungratefulness." The comments section was a battlefield of its own. Half the town was calling me selfish and heartless, saying I should respect my elders and take care of the people who sacrificed for me. The other half was asking what kind of parents sue their own daughter, especially one who served her country for over 2 decades. What they didn't know was the whole story. What they didn't know was that while other kids were playing Little League and going to birthday parties, I was feeding livestock at 5 in the morning before school, hauling hay bales that weighed more than I did, and running the entire vegetable stand operation that funded my parents' comfortable lifestyle. What they didn't know was that every penny I earned from selling produce at the farmer's market went straight into their pockets, while I wore thrift store clothes and watched other kids get allowances for doing basic chores. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, had always been a master manipulator. She could smile at church on Sunday morning while telling the congregation how proud she was of her daughter serving overseas, then call me that same evening to complain that I wasn't sending enough money home. She'd perfected the art of making me feel guilty for having my own life, my own needs, my own dreams that didn't revolve around propping up their financial stability. Even when I was deployed in hostile territory, dodging mortar fire and coordinating supply convoys through Taliban-controlled regions, she'd somehow make the conversation about how stressed she was about the farm and how much easier things would be if I just came home and helped out. My father, Robert Caldwell, was different but equally destructive. Where Mom was manipulative, Dad was simply absent. He'd nod along with whatever she said, never standing up for me, never questioning whether it was fair to expect a child to work 60-hour weeks during summer break while he watched television and complained about his back pain. He was the kind of man who believed that children owed their parents everything, that respect meant never questioning authority, and that military service was just an expensive way to avoid real responsibility. When I'd call home from Bagram, airfield, exhausted after 18-hour shifts coordinating humanitarian aid deliveries, he'd grunt a hello and hand the phone to Mom within 30 seconds. The irony was suffocating. They were suing me for ungratefulness while I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of their love. Even after joining the Army at 18, I'd sent money home religiously, 20% of every paycheck, sometimes more when they claimed there was an emergency. When Mom called crying about the roof needing repairs, I emptied my savings account and wired them $8,000. When Dad's truck broke down, I took out a personal loan to buy him a replacement. When they wanted to renovate the kitchen, I cashed out my leave and worked extra shifts to cover the cost. But it was never enough. There was always another crisis, another emergency, another reason why I needed to sacrifice more. When I got promoted to sergeant, Mom's first reaction wasn't congratulations, but disappointment that my raise wasn't bigger. When I received a commendation for exceptional service during a particularly dangerous deployment, Dad's response was to ask if it came with hazard pay. They had turned my love for them into a transaction, and I was always in debt. The breaking point came 6 months ago. I had finally saved enough money to put a down payment on a small house in Nashville, about 40 minutes from their farm. After 2 decades of living in barracks, temporary housing, and cramped apartment rentals, I was ready to have a place that was truly mine. Something with a garden where I could grow my own vegetables, a garage where I could work on the vintage motorcycle I'd been restoring, and enough space to host the holiday dinners I'd always dreamed of sharing with the family that might actually want me there. When I told them about the house, their reaction was swift and brutal. Mom immediately started crying, saying I was abandoning them in their old age, that they had sacrificed everything for me, and this was how I repaid them. Dad accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, said I was forgetting where I came from, and who had raised me. They demanded I use the house money to instead buy them a new RV so they could see the country before they died. As if they were terminally ill instead of perfectly healthy 60-year-olds who had never worked as hard as I did in a single day. That's when I finally said no. For the first time in my life, I told them that I had given enough, that I deserved to have something for myself after 24 years of military service and a lifetime of supporting their lifestyle. I explained that I had been sending them money for over 2 decades, that I had funded their vacations and improvements and emergencies while living paycheck to paycheck myself. I told them I loved them, but that I was done being their personal ATM. The conversation ended with Mom hanging up on me and Dad sending a text message that simply said, "You'll regret this, Jennifer. Family means everything, and you just threw yours away." I thought that was the end of it. I thought they'd cool off, maybe even come to understand my perspective after some time to think it through. I never imagined they'd hire lawyers and try to legally force me to fund their retirement fantasies. But as I sat in my tiny apartment, reading through the lawsuit documentation, something else was brewing in my mind. If we were going to court, if they wanted to make this about money and obligations and who owed what to whom, then let's do this properly. Let's talk about every hour I worked on that farm from age 5 to 18. Let's calculate the market rate for agricultural labor, adjusted for inflation. Let's discuss child labor laws and fair compensation, and whether parents have the right to financially exploit their children for nearly 2 decades. I pulled out my laptop and started making a list. Every memory of dawn to dusk work in the fields. Every weekend spent at farmers' markets instead of with friends. Every summer vacation that was actually just unpaid labor disguised as family time. Every birthday where my gift was being allowed to work fewer hours. Every Christmas where I gave them my earnings and received lecture about gratitude in return. The numbers were staggering. 18 years of agricultural work, averaging 50 hours per week during school, and 70 during summers and breaks. Minimum wage for agricultural workers in Tennessee, adjusted for the years I worked, plus overtime calculations, holiday premiums for working Christmas and New Year's Day, hazard pay for operating dangerous machinery as a miner. The total came to $847,000 in unpaid wages, not including interest or penalties for child labor violations. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding with something between rage and vindication. They wanted to take me to court for being ungrateful? They wanted to claim I owed them money for the privilege of being their daughter? Fine. Let's see how grateful they feel when they're facing a counter lawsuit for nearly $1 million in stolen labor. My phone rang. The caller ID showed my best friend from the service, Maria Santos, now a successful lawyer in Atlanta. We'd served together in Afghanistan, where she'd saved my life during a convoy ambush, and I'd returned the favor 6 months later during a base attack. If anyone would understand the situation and help me fight back, it was her. Jen, I just saw the news online. Maria's voice was tight with anger. Please tell me you're not actually getting sued by your own parents. Oh, it's real, I said, scanning the legal documents again. They want money for emotional distress because I won't fund their European vacation. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, and I've prosecuted cases involving people who sued their neighbors for breathing too loudly. I took a deep breath. Maria, I need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I need someone who understands what it's like to fight battles that other people can't even imagine. And I think it's time my parents learned what happens when you declare war on someone who's actually been to war. There was a pause. Then Maria's voice came back stronger than ever. Tell me everything, Jen, every detail. Because if they want to play legal games about family obligations and money, we're going to give them a masterclass in consequences they never saw coming. As I started telling her the whole story, from childhood labor to military service to their outrageous lawsuit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since I was 5 years old and too small to properly handle the tools they gave me, I wasn't trying to prove myself worthy of their love. I was preparing to prove that their love had never been worth the price they charged for it. The war was just beginning, and this time I wasn't fighting for them. I was fighting against them. And unlike those 18 years on the farm, this was a battle I intended to win. The first memory that came flooding back was my 5th birthday. Most kids remember cake and presents and friends singing happy birthday. I remember my father shaking me awake at 4:30 in the morning, telling me the chickens needed feeding and the eggs wouldn't collect themselves. You're 5 now, Jennifer, he said, his breath smelling like coffee and disappointment. Old enough to earn your keep around here. That morning, stumbling through the pre-dawn darkness with a flashlight bigger than my forearms, I learned that birthdays in the Caldwell household weren't celebrations. They were promotions. Each year meant more responsibility, more work, more ways I could prove I deserved the food they put on my plate and the roof they kept over my head. Other kids got allowances for making their beds. I got lectures about gratitude for being allowed to sleep indoors. The chicken coop became my first real classroom. Mom showed me how to reach under the hens without getting pecked, how to check for eggs in the nesting boxes, how to clean and sort them by size in the wooden crates we sold at market. Gentle but confident, she'd say, demonstrating the technique. Chickens can smell fear, and scared children don't earn their keep. I was 5 years old, barely tall enough to reach the higher nests even on my tiptoes, and already learning that my worth was measured in dozens of eggs and pounds of feed, distributed. By the time I turned 6, my daily routine looked nothing like my classmates. While they watched Saturday morning cartoons, I was in the vegetable garden at sunrise, pulling weeds from endless rows of tomatoes, peppers, and squash. My small hands learned to distinguish between valuable plants and invasive weeds. Learned to water carefully so nothing was wasted. Learned to harvest at exactly the right moment for maximum market value. Dad would walk the rows behind me, criticizing my technique, pointing out missed weeds or damaged vegetables. This isn't a game, Jennifer. This food puts money in our pockets and keeps this farm running. The farmer's market became my weekend. Prison. Every Saturday and Sunday from April through October, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning to help load the truck with our produce. By 4, we'd be driving the 30 miles to the Millfield Farmers Market, where I'd spend the next 10 hours standing behind a folding table, weighing vegetables, counting change, and smiling at customers who thought it was so sweet that such a young girl was learning about business. What they didn't see was how my feet ached in shoes that were always too small, how my back cramped from lifting crates that weighed more than I did, how I watched other kids playing in the park across the street while I calculated prices and bagged produce. Mom had turned me into her perfect little salesperson. "Jennifer knows everything about these vegetables," she'd tell customers, nudging me forward. "Tell Mrs. Patterson about the tomatoes, honey." And I would recite the script she'd drilled into me. How long they'd been growing, what made them special, why they were worth the premium price. Customers ate it up, this cute little girl who could talk about soil pH and growing seasons like she was reading from a textbook. They had no idea I'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The money I earned went straight into their pockets. Every dollar from vegetable sales, every tip from customers who thought I was adorable, every penny I found on the ground around our booth. "This is how families work," Dad would explain when I asked why I never got any of the money I helped earn. "Everyone contributes according to their ability. Your ability is working. Our ability is managing the money." I was 7 years old and already learning that my labor was valuable, but that I wasn't valuable enough to benefit from it. School became my only escape, but even that was complicated. I'd arrive exhausted from morning chores, sometimes with dirt, still under my fingernails despite scrubbing in the school bathroom. Teachers would notice me falling asleep during afternoon classes, but when they called home to express concern, my parents painted me as a lazy child who needed more structure, not less work. "Jennifer tends to dramatize things," Mom would tell them. A little responsibility never hurt anyone. We're teaching her the value of hard work. The other kids at school lived in a different universe. They talked about allowances and toys and weekend trips to movies or amusement parks. They complained about having to clean their rooms or take out the trash once a week. I listened to these conversations like an anthropologist studying an alien culture. Clean one room? Take out trash once a week? I was responsible for maintaining an entire agricultural operation, and I was 8 years old. Birthday parties were the worst. Getting invited meant asking permission, which meant explaining why I needed time off from farm work, which usually meant the answer was no. The few times I was allowed to attend, I'd arrive late and leave early, never able to fully enjoy myself because I knew there would be consequences at home. "While you were playing games and eating cake," Dad would say, "the animals still needed feeding and the vegetables still needed watering. Fun time costs money, Jennifer. Someone has to pay for it." When I turned 10, they promoted me to equipment operator. The riding mower was my first real machine, a rusty old Craftsman that required more strength than I had to properly control. "You're big enough now," Dad announced, showing me how to engage the blades and adjust the cutting height. "Grass doesn't cut itself, and we can't afford to hire help when we've got perfectly good labor right here." I spent that entire summer learning to navigate slopes and tight corners, jumping off to move obstacles, praying I wouldn't tip the mower or run over my own feet. The hay operation was brutal. Baling high meant working in 90-degree heat, loading 50-pound bales onto trailers, stacking them in the barn loft. Dad would drive the tractor while I ran behind, lifting bales that were nearly half my body weight, my back screaming with every movement. "Hay waits for no one," he'd shout over the engine noise. "Weather's coming in, and we've got to get this crop in before it rains." I was 11 years old, wearing gloves that were too big for my hands, developing muscles that made me look different from other girls my age. The financial reality of our operation became clear as I got older. We weren't struggling farmers barely making ends meet. We were pulling in over $60,000 a year from vegetable sales, hay production, and seasonal pumpkin patches. Dad had a brand new pickup truck. Mom got her hair done every week at the fancy salon in town. They took vacation trips to Florida every winter, leaving me with my grandmother who was too old to supervise much of anything. But when I asked for new clothes or school supplies or permission to join sports teams, the answer was always the same. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Jennifer. Every dollar spent on you is a dollar we can't invest in the farm." High school brought new responsibilities and new equipment. The tractor became my daily companion, a 1980s Ford with no air conditioning and a temperamental transmission. I learned to bush hog fields, disc soil for planting, and operate the hay baler when Dad's back was acting up again. My 16th birthday present was a commercial driver's permit, so I could haul produce to markets in neighboring counties. Other kids got cars. I got the legal right to work longer hours in more dangerous conditions. The isolation was almost worse than the physical labor. My classmates were dating, going to dances, participating in sports and clubs, and all the activities that make high school memorable. I was too tired for most of it, too busy for the rest. Weekends were always work days. School holidays meant extra time for farm projects. Summer vacation was a joke. Just 3 months of 70-hour work weeks without the distraction of classes. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the pattern during my junior year. She called me into her office after I'd missed another school dance due to hay season. "Jennifer, I'm concerned about your work-life balance," she said, reviewing my academic record. "Your grades are excellent, but you seem to miss a lot of social activities. Are things okay at home?" I gave her the script my parents had taught me. I was learning valuable life skills, developing a strong work ethic, preparing for the real world. She looked skeptical, but didn't push further. College was never really an option, though my grades were good enough for scholarships. "College is for people who can't make it in the real world," Dad would say whenever the subject came up. "You've got a guaranteed job right here, steady income, security. Why would you throw that away to accumulate debt and waste 4 years studying useless theories?" What he meant was that college would interfere with their free labor force. I was too valuable as an unpaid worker to be allowed to develop other options. The military recruiter who visited our school during my senior year might as well have been offering passage to another planet. Staff Sergeant Williams talked about education benefits, travel opportunities, career training, and something I'd never experienced before: being valued for your potential instead of just your labor. When I picked up the recruitment materials, I felt like I was holding a treasure map to a life I'd never imagined possible. Telling my parents about my interest in military service was like declaring war in the living room. "Absolutely not," Mommy said immediately. "We've invested 18 years in training you, and you want to just walk away after everything we've done for you?" Dad was even more direct. "Ungrateful. That's what you are. Pure ungrateful. We give you food, shelter, clothing, education, and this is how you repay us? By abandoning your family for some government fantasy?" But something had changed in me. Maybe it was seeing my classmates make plans for their futures. Maybe it was reading about the wider world in my history classes. Maybe it was just exhaustion from 18 years of being treated like farm equipment instead of a daughter. For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. "I'm 18 years old," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "I can make my own decisions about my life." The final months before graduation were a cold war. They stopped speaking to me except to give work orders. Meals became silent affairs where they discussed farm business around me as if I weren't there. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, they sat in the audience with expressions that looked more like they were attending a funeral than celebrating their daughter's achievement. 3 days after graduation, I took the bus to the recruitment station in Nashville and signed the papers that would change everything. When I came home that evening to pack my few belongings, Mom was crying in the kitchen while Dad stared out the window at fields I'd worked since childhood. "You'll regret this," he said without turning around. "The world's going to chew you up and spit you out, and when you come crawling back, we might not be here to pick up the pieces." I looked around the farmhouse one last time, at the kitchen where I'd prepared countless meals after working all day, at the living room where I'd fallen asleep doing homework after midnight, at the hallway lined with pictures of farm equipment, but none of me. "I know you think you gave me everything," I said quietly. "But what you gave me was the strength to survive anything, just not in the way you intended." Walking out that door with my duffel bag and my mother's silver locket, the only thing of value I truly owned, felt like stepping out of a prison I'd been born into. I was 18 years old, and for the first time in my life, my time belonged to me. The bus to Fort Benning pulled away from the Nashville station at 6:15 in the morning, and I pressed my face to the window watching Tennessee disappear behind me. 23 other recruits filled the seats around me, most of them boys fresh out of high school who wouldn't stop talking about video games and action movies. They had no idea what real work looked like, what it meant to carry responsibility that could break your back and your spirit. As we crossed into Georgia, I realized this was the furthest I'd ever been from Millfield County. At 18, I was finally leaving the 40-square-mile radius that had defined my entire existence. Basic training was supposed to break you down and build you back up, but I discovered something the drill sergeants hadn't expected. I was already broken down. All those years of 4:30 wake-up calls meant reveille felt like sleeping in. Physical training that left other recruits gasping and crying was just another morning workout for someone who'd been hauling hay bales since she was 10. When Drill Sergeant Martinez screamed in my face about my pathetic performance, all I heard was a variation of my father's voice telling me I wasn't working hard enough. The difference was that here, when you met the standards, you got recognition. When you exceeded expectations, you got promoted. When you showed leadership potential, you got more responsibility that came with respect instead of just more unpaid labor. 3 weeks into basic, I was selected as squad leader for my platoon. 6 weeks in, I scored expert marksman on the rifle range. By graduation, I was receiving the leadership award and had already been approached by recruiters for advanced military occupational specialties. My parents didn't come to my basic training graduation. They sent a card with a picture of the farm and a note that said, "Hope you're learning valuable lessons. The hay crop is coming in early this year. Love, Mom and Dad." No congratulations, no acknowledgement of my achievements, just a reminder that the real world, their world, was still waiting for me to come to my senses and return to my proper place. I chose military police as my specialty, drawn to the idea of enforcing justice and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The training at Fort Leonard Wood introduced me to legal procedures, evidence collection, and constitutional rights, concepts I'd never encountered in a household where authority was absolute and questioning it was tantamount to betrayal. Learning about due process and equal protection under the law felt like discovering a foreign language that described freedoms I'd never known existed. My first duty station was Fort Campbell, Kentucky, close enough to home that my parents expected regular visits and continued financial contributions. I had been sending them money since my first paycheck, $200 a month that represented nearly a quarter of my income as a private. When I called to tell them about my new assignment, Mom's first question wasn't about my training or my responsibilities. It was about whether Kentucky meant I'd be able to send more money now that I was so close to home. The reality of military life was a revelation. For the first time, I lived in a world where hard work was rewarded, where competence was valued regardless of your background, where showing initiative led to advancement instead of exploitation. My sergeant, a career soldier named Patricia Wong, became the first authority figure in my life who seemed genuinely interested in my development as a person rather than my usefulness as a tool. "Caldwell," she said during my first performance review, "you've got natural leadership instincts and an incredible work ethic. Have you thought about pursuing a college degree through the military education program?" College. The word still felt foreign, like something that happened to other people. But Sergeant Wong handed me enrollment forms for the University of Maryland's correspondence program and told me the Army would pay for it. "Intelligence and drive like yours shouldn't be wasted," she said. "You could go as far as you want in this organization." I started taking courses in criminal justice and business administration, studying in the barracks after duty hours, reading textbooks that opened up worlds of knowledge I'd never imagined. Every class felt like stolen treasure, every assignment a step further away from the limited future my parents had mapped out for me. When I called home to share my excitement about making the dean's list my first semester, Dad's response was predictably dismissive. "Book learning won't teach you how to run a farm, Jennifer. You're wasting time on nonsense when you could be building something real." The financial pressure from home intensified as I progressed in rank and education. Every promotion meant phone calls demanding larger monthly payments. Every achievement was met with reminders about family obligations and parental sacrifices. When I made specialist and received a modest pay increase, Mom called crying about medical bills and farm equipment repairs, insisting I needed to send at least $400 a month now that I was making good money. The manipulation tactics that had controlled me for 18 years felt less effective with distance and perspective, but they still worked. Guilt was their primary weapon. Elaborate stories about how much they'd sacrificed to raise me. How other parents had children who appreciated them. How disappointed they were in my selfishness. I continued sending money, continued absorbing their disappointment, continued trying to prove I was worthy of love that seemed to come with an ever-increasing price tag. My first deployment changed everything. We were sent to Kosovo as part of the peacekeeping mission, and suddenly I was responsible for real consequences in life and death situations, leading patrols through hostile territory, investigating incidents between ethnic factions, protecting refugees who had lost everything. These experiences put my childhood grievances into perspective, while simultaneously validating every instinct I'd developed about justice and fairness. In Kosovo, I met Captain James Rivera, a JAG officer who was investigating war crimes and human rights violations. During a particularly difficult case involving child exploitation, we started talking about family dynamics and the different forms abuse could take. "Economic exploitation of children is still exploitation," he said after I'd shared some carefully edited stories about my upbringing. "Just because it's legal doesn't make it ethical." That conversation planted a seed that would grow over the years. For the first time, someone with legal expertise had suggested that what I'd experienced might not have been normal family responsibility, but something darker. Captain Rivera gave me books about family law and children's rights, materials I read during off-duty hours while questioning everything I'd been taught about obligation and gratitude. When I returned from deployment, I was promoted to sergeant and assigned to train new military police officers. Teaching others about legal procedures and constitutional rights reinforced my own understanding of justice and fairness. I began to see my childhood through the lens of labor law, workers' rights, and child protection statutes. The more I learned, the clearer it became that my parents had operated outside legal and ethical boundaries for years. My relationship with them continued deteriorating as I gained confidence and perspective. Phone calls became arguments about money, visits became lectures about ingratitude, and every interaction reinforced the growing distance between who I was becoming and who they expected me to remain. They seemed incapable of seeing me as anything other than their wayward investment, someone who had stolen their property and needed to be reclaimed. The second deployment was to Afghanistan, where I served as a convoy security specialist protecting supply routes between forward operating bases. The dangers were real and immediate: improvised explosive devices, sniper attacks, rocket-propelled grenades that could turn an armored vehicle into burning wreckage in seconds. But even in a war zone, surrounded by constant threats, I felt more valued and respected than I ever had at home. My parents' reaction to my combat deployment was typically self-centered. Instead of worry or pride, they expressed frustration that overseas pay meant I should be sending even more money home. "You're making hazard pay now," Dad said during one satellite phone call, "so there's no excuse for not supporting your family properly." I was dodging Taliban bullets, and he was calculating how much my near-death experiences should be worth to him financially. The breaking point came during my third tour, when I was wounded by shrapnel from a roadside bomb. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to require evacuation and several weeks of recovery. When I called home from the military hospital in Germany, barely coherent from pain medication. Mom's first concern was whether the injury would affect my ability to work and send money. "This military nonsense has gone on long enough," she said. "It's time to come home and focus on real responsibilities." Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by other wounded soldiers whose families were flying across oceans to be with them, I realized that my parents had never seen me as a daughter worth protecting or celebrating. They saw me as a resource to be managed, an investment that had wandered off and needed to be reclaimed. Every achievement in my military career had been met with resentment rather than pride. Every promotion seen as a step further away from their control rather than recognition of my capabilities. I stopped calling home regularly. I stopped sending money every month. For the first time in my adult life, I began keeping my earnings for myself, investing in my own future rather than subsidizing their lifestyle. The guilt was overwhelming at first. 20 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. But I was finally starting to understand the difference between genuine family love and financial exploitation disguised as obligation. The angry letters and phone calls started immediately. I was selfish, ungrateful, abandoning my responsibilities. They had given me everything, and I was throwing it back in their faces. Other families had children who appreciated their sacrifices and took care of their parents. I was a disappointment who would never amount to anything without their guidance and support, but I was amounting to something, and they couldn't see it because it existed outside their narrow definition of success. I had earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, completed advanced leadership training, and been selected for officer candidate school. I was building a career based on merit and achievement rather than family connections or inherited obligations. For the first time in my life, my future belonged to me. The final conversation before our relationship completely collapsed happened during my last week in Afghanistan. I called to tell them I'd been accepted to officer candidate school and would be commissioned as a second lieutenant upon completion of the program. Instead of congratulations, I got a lecture about wasted time and missed opportunities. 24 years old and still playing soldier, Dad said with disgust. When are you going to grow up and take care of your real responsibilities? That's when I finally said what I'd been thinking for years. My real responsibility is to myself and to the people I serve. I don't owe you my life just because you raised me. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Mom crying in the background about ungrateful children and wasted sacrifices. "Fine," Dad said finally, his voice cold and final. "If that's how you feel, then don't bother coming home. We're done pretending you're part of this family." The line went dead, and I sat in my tent staring at the satellite phone, feeling simultaneously heartbroken and liberated. I was 24 years old, and for the first time since childhood, I was truly free to become whoever I was meant to be. Officer. Candidate school at Fort Benning marked the beginning of my transformation from dutiful daughter to independent woman. The 12 weeks of intensive training pushed every recruit to their physical and mental limits, but I thrived in an environment where excellence was demanded and mediocrity wasn't tolerated. While other candidates struggled with the academic coursework, I found myself naturally drawn to military law, logistics management, and personnel administration. The leadership principles they taught, integrity, accountability, putting your people first, felt like discovering a moral framework I'd been searching for my entire life. My commissioning ceremony was a milestone I'd dreamed about since that first conversation with the recruiter in high school. Standing in dress uniform, raising my right hand to take the oath of office, I felt the weight of genuine achievement settling on my shoulders. The gold bars of a second lieutenant represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination to prove myself in a world that valued merit over birthright. My parents didn't attend the ceremony. They sent a card with a picture of their new riding lawnmower and a note asking when I planned to visit and contribute to the family again. My first assignment as an officer was Fort Hood, Texas, where I served as a platoon leader in the military police corps. managing 30 soldiers, overseeing base security operations, and coordinating with civilian law enforcement agencies gave me responsibilities I'd never experienced. Authority that came with respect rather than fear. Power that was meant to serve others rather than exploit them. My soldiers looked to me for guidance, protection, and fair treatment. For the first time in my life, I understood what healthy authority relationships looked like. The financial independence that came with my officer's salary was intoxicating. After years of sending most of my earnings home, I suddenly had enough money to rent a decent apartment, buy reliable transportation, and start building savings for my own future. I opened investment accounts, started contributing to retirement plans, and even began shopping for furniture that I chose based on my own preferences rather than hand-me-downs and military surplus. Every purchase felt like a small declaration of independence from a family that had never asked what I wanted or needed. But the calls from home continued with increasing desperation and hostility. Mom would cry about medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover, home repairs that couldn't wait, and emergencies that always seemed to coincide with my payday. Dad would lecture me about family loyalty and remind me that everything I'd achieved was built on the foundation they'd provided. "We taught you work ethic," he'd say. "We gave you discipline and character. Now you're using our gifts to abandon the people who made you who you are." The manipulation tactics evolved as their financial situation apparently worsened. They began involving other family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins I barely knew suddenly calling to express concern about my selfish behavior and to remind me of family obligations. Church members from their congregation would send messages about honoring thy father and mother. Even my grandmother, now in her 80s, was recruited to guilt me about disappointing the people who had sacrificed so much for my success. During my second year at Fort Hood, I was selected for advanced training in military justice and became certified as a paralegal specializing in administrative law. The coursework covered employment law, workers' rights, and legal protections for vulnerable populations. One particular class on child labor laws hit uncomfortably close to home. As I learned about minimum wage requirements, overtime regulations, and workplace safety protections for minors, I began calculating what my childhood labor would have been worth under federal employment standards. The numbers were staggering. 18 years of agricultural work, starting at age 5, averaging 40 hours per week during school and 60 hours during summers and holidays. Even using conservative estimates and applying minimum wage rates from the years I'd worked, the total came to over $400,000 in unpaid wages. Add overtime premiums, holiday pay, and penalties for child labor violations, and the figure approached $750,000. For the first time, I had concrete data to support what I'd always felt intuitively, that I'd been systematically exploited for nearly 2 decades. My romantic relationships during this period were complicated by the emotional baggage I carried from my family situation. I dated fellow officers and civilian professionals, but I struggled to explain why I never talked about my parents or why I got anxious whenever relationships became serious enough to discuss families. How do you tell someone that your parents view love as a financial transaction? How do you explain that you've been conditioned to believe your worth is measured by your usefulness to others? Captain Michael Torres, a JAG officer I met during a joint training exercise, became the first person I trusted enough to share the complete story of my upbringing. We'd been dating for 6 months when he noticed my visible stress after particularly difficult phone calls from home. One evening, after my mother had called crying about property taxes and demanding I send money immediately, Michael asked the question no one had ever asked before. Do you actually want to help them? Or do you feel like you have to? That conversation lasted until dawn. For the first time, I told someone about the endless hours of unpaid labor, the financial manipulation, the way my achievements were consistently diminished or ignored. Michael listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me see patterns I'd never recognized. "Jennifer," he said finally, What you're describing isn't normal family responsibility. It's financial abuse, and it's been going on since you were a child. Having a legal professional validate my experiences was both liberating and terrifying. Michael helped me research family law and workers' rights, showing me precedents where courts had awarded damages for unpaid family labor. He introduced me to concepts like financial elder abuse, family economic exploitation, and the legal obligations parents actually have versus the unlimited demands mine were making. Your parents trained you to believe you owe them everything, he explained. But legally and ethically, children don't owe their parents compensation for being raised. Armed with this new knowledge, I began setting boundaries for the first time in my adult life. I stopped answering every phone call immediately. I refused to discuss money during family conversations. When they demanded explanations for my decreased financial support, I told them I was building my own financial security and couldn't continue subsidizing their lifestyle indefinitely. The reaction was swift and brutal: accusations of selfishness, threats to cut off all contact, and elaborate guilt campaigns involving extended family members. My military career flourished as my personal life stabilized. I was promoted to first lieutenant ahead of schedule and selected for specialized training in criminal investigations. My commanding officers praised my analytical skills, attention to detail, and ability to remain calm under pressure. What they didn't know was that these abilities had been forged in a childhood where survival depended on working efficiently, avoiding mistakes, and managing unpredictable authority figures. The deployment to Afghanistan as part of the surge operations in 2010 marked another turning point in my development. As a military police officer responsible for base security and detainee operations, I encountered situations that required quick thinking, moral clarity, and the ability to make life and death decisions. The combat environment stripped away all pretense and forced me to rely on core principles I'd developed despite my upbringing rather than because of it. One incident in particular crystallized my understanding of justice and exploitation. We discovered a local contractor who had been using child laborers to build fortifications around our base, paying them pennies while pocketing thousands in American taxpayer dollars. The children, some as young as 8, worked 12-hour days, in dangerous conditions while their families received barely enough to survive. As I processed the contractor's arrest and coordinated care for the children, I saw my own childhood reflected in their exhausted faces and calloused hands. The parallel was impossible to ignore. While my situation had been legal and involved family rather than strangers, the fundamental dynamic was identical. Adults exploiting children's labor for personal profit, while justifying it as character building or family obligation. The contractor's defense sounded remarkably similar to my parents' justifications. He was teaching the children valuable skills, providing them with structure and purpose, preparing them for the harsh realities of adult life. My letters home during this deployment took on a different tone. Instead of sharing experiences or asking about family news, I found myself asking pointed questions about the farm's finances, my parents' retirement plans, and their expectations for my continued financial support. The responses revealed a level of entitlement that shocked me even after years of manipulation. They had apparently been telling people in town that I was sending substantial money home, using my military salary to fund home improvements and vacation plans. When I questioned these expenditures, pointing out that I'd never agreed to fund their retirement or lifestyle choices, the conversation escalated into open hostility. "After everything we've done for you," Mom screamed during one particularly heated phone call, "this is how you treat us? We gave you life. We raised you. We taught you everything you know. You owe us more than you could ever repay." Dad's contribution was more direct. "If you don't start acting like family, we'll stop treating you like family." The threat felt more like a promise of liberation than a punishment. I was 31 years old, had served my country with distinction for over a decade, earned a master's degree in criminal justice, and built a successful career based on my own merit and dedication. Yet my parents continued to treat me like a rebellious teenager who needed to be controlled and corrected. Their inability to see me as an independent adult with my own rights and priorities had become a source of constant conflict and emotional exhaustion. My final attempt at reconciliation came during a brief leave period when I flew back to Tennessee to visit. The farm looked exactly the same equipment, the same routines, the same expectations that I would immediately resume my role as unpaid labor. Within hours of arriving, Dad was assigning me chores and Mom was complaining about how much money they'd had to spend on hired help since I'd abandoned them. The breaking point came when they presented me with a detailed financial plan they'd developed for my future. They expected me to leave the military after my current enlistment, return to the farm permanently, and use my military savings to fund expansion of their agricultural operation. In return, they would allow me to live in the old farmhouse and eventually inherit the property, after they'd extracted decades more unpaid labor and financial support. "We've been patient with your military phase," Dad explained, spreading out papers covered with calculations and projections. "But it's time to focus on real life and family responsibilities. This farm could be worth millions if we develop it properly, and you're the key to making that happen." They had literally planned out the next 30 years of my life without once asking what I wanted or considering that I might have my own dreams and ambitions. I looked around the kitchen where I'd prepared countless meals after full days of farm work, at parents who had never once asked about my achievements or goals, at a future mapped out entirely for their benefit rather than mine. "I'm not coming back," I said quietly. "I'm making the military my career, and I'm building my own life. You need to make your own plans because they can't include me." The explosion of anger that followed confirmed everything I'd suspected about their motivations. This wasn't about family love or mutual support. It was about maintaining control over an asset they'd been developing for 3 decades. I was their retirement plan, their financial security, their solution to every problem they'd ever face. The idea that I might have my own purposes and priorities was not just disappointing, but incomprehensible. I left the farm that night and never returned. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was demolished, leaving us on opposite sides of a chasm that had been widening for years. But for the first time in my life, I was standing on the side I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been assigned. The years following my final break with my parents brought a freedom I'd never experienced, but they also brought an unexpected development that would eventually prove crucial to the legal battle ahead. While I flourished in my military career, moving through promotions and assignments that took me from Texas to Germany to South Korea, my parents' financial situation began a steady decline that they desperately tried to hide from the community that had always seen them as successful landowners. The first signs appeared in 2015, 3 years after our last face-to-face conversation. My cousin Rachel, one of the few family members who maintained contact with me, mentioned during a brief phone call that the farm seemed to be struggling. "Uncle Robert's been selling off equipment," she said carefully, clearly uncomfortable, sharing family business. "And Aunt Patricia's been talking about downsizing the house. I thought you should know in case they try to contact you." The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of demanding my financial support, they were too proud to admit they actually needed help. My military career had taken me to Stuttgart, Germany, where I served as the non-commissioned officer in charge of legal affairs for a major logistics command. The position required coordinating with German civilian authorities, managing complex international legal issues, and overseeing a staff of 12 legal specialists. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that connected directly to my childhood experiences with justice and fairness, but now I was on the side that protected rights rather than violated them. The distance from Tennessee provided perspective I couldn't have gained while stationed in the United States. European attitudes toward family relationships, work-life balance, and individual autonomy were refreshingly different from the suffocating obligations I'd grown up with. My German colleagues were horrified when I explained American concepts of children supporting their parents financially well into adulthood. Families should support each other emotionally, my supervisor, Major Klaus Weber, explained during one of our conversations about cultural differences. But expecting children to fund their parents' lifestyle? This is not healthy family dynamics. During my time in Germany, I began dating Dr. Andreas Müller, a civilian psychologist who worked with military families dealing with deployment stress and relationship issues. Andreas had studied family systems therapy and was particularly interested in intergenerational trauma and economic abuse patterns. Our relationship deepened as he helped me understand the psychological mechanisms my parents had used to maintain control over my life and finances. What you're describing is called financial enmeshment, Andreas explained during one of our evening walks through the Bavarian countryside. Your parents never allowed you to develop financial independence or personal autonomy. They created a system where your worth was tied to your economic productivity, and love was conditional on your willingness to submit to their financial demands. Having professional terminology for my experiences was both validating and unsettling. It confirmed that my family dynamics were abnormal while highlighting how deeply the patterns had been ingrained. Through Andreas, I learned about legal precedents in European family law that recognized economic exploitation of adult children as a form of abuse. Several Scandinavian countries had established legal frameworks for addressing situations where parents systematically exploited their children's labor or demanded unreasonable financial support. The concept that adult children had rights that superseded parental demands was revolutionary to someone who'd been raised to believe that family obligations were absolute and unquestionable. My promotion to captain in 2016 came with reassignment to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where I was selected for the prestigious Command and General Staff College. The year-long program brought together field-grade officers from all military branches and several allied nations to study advanced leadership, strategic planning, and joint operations. For the first time in my career, I was surrounded by peers who had achieved similar levels of success through merit, rather than family connections or inherited advantages. The academic environment at Leavenworth encouraged critical thinking about complex problems, and I found myself applying analytical frameworks to my own family situation with increasing clarity. A course on organizational behavior included modules on toxic leadership, exploitation of subordinates, and the long-term effects of abusive authority relationships. The parallels to my childhood were impossible to ignore. My parents had operated like toxic commanders who viewed their subordinates as resources to be consumed rather than people to be developed. My thesis project focused on legal protections for military families against financial exploitation, research that required extensive study of family law, consumer protection statutes, and employment regulations. The more I learned about workers' rights and fair compensation standards, the more clearly I understood that my parents had violated numerous legal and ethical principles throughout my childhood. Armed with this knowledge, I began documenting everything I could remember about my unpaid labor, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked hours worked, wages that should have been paid, and legal violations that had occurred. The documentation process was emotionally exhausting, but intellectually fascinating. I calculated that between ages 5 and 18, I had worked approximately 43,000 hours on farm operations that generated substantial income for my parents. Using conservative estimates of minimum wage rates for agricultural workers during those years, plus overtime premiums and holiday pay, the total value of my unpaid labor exceeded $850,000. Add interest, penalties for child labor violations, and compensation for the educational and social opportunities I'd missed, and the figure approached $1.2 million. Meanwhile, reports from Tennessee painted an increasingly desperate picture of my parents' financial situation. The farm that had once generated $60,000 annually in produce sales was now struggling to break even. Equipment that should have been replaced years ago was breaking down regularly, and my parents, now in their early 60s, were physically unable to maintain the intensive labor schedule that had sustained their operation when they had me as free labor. They had apparently tried hiring workers to replace me, but legitimate employees expected fair wages, regular hours, and basic workplace protections, luxuries I'd never received. The cost of paying actual employees quickly made their business model unsustainable. According to Rachel, they'd gone through 6 different hired hands in 4 years, each one quitting after a few weeks of my father's management style and my mother's unrealistic expectations. The first direct contact from my parents in 5 years came through a lawyer's letter in late 2017. Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, a firm in Nashville that specialized in family law and estate planning, sent a formal notification that Robert and Patricia Caldwell were seeking legal recourse for abandonment of family obligations and breach of implied contract regarding agricultural operations. The letter demanded that I contact them immediately to discuss resolution of outstanding family financial obligations. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, Maria Santos, who had left the military and established a successful practice in Atlanta, specializing in family law and civil rights cases. Maria's response was swift and unambiguous. This is an intimidation tactic with no legal foundation. There's no such thing as an implied contract requiring adult children to support their parents financially, and abandonment of family obligations isn't a recognized legal cause of action. They're fishing to see if you'll cave to pressure. But the lawyer's letter revealed something important about my parents' mindset and strategy. They genuinely believed that I owed them compensation for raising me, that my military success had been built on their investment, and that my refusal to support them financially constituted a form of theft. The language in the letter suggested they were prepared to pursue legal action to force me to resume financial support, apparently believing that courts would side with parents against an ungrateful daughter. Maria advised me to begin preparing for potential litigation by gathering evidence of my childhood labor and the financial exploitation I'd experienced. If they want to make this about money and legal obligations, she said, we need to be ready to show a court exactly what those obligations looked like from your perspective. Document everything you can remember, and let's build a timeline of labor violations that would make any judge's head spin. The research process revealed additional disturbing patterns in my parents' behavior. They had apparently been telling people in their community that I was sending substantial money home and had portrayed my military service as a temporary phase before returning to take over the family farm. When neighbors asked about my absence, they explained that I was finding myself but would eventually settle down and fulfill my family responsibilities. More troubling was evidence that they had been using my name and military service to secure credit and business loans. Several local businesses had extended favorable terms based on their representation that their daughter was a successful military officer who would eventually return to support the family business. They had essentially been trading on my reputation and achievements to maintain their lifestyle while publicly criticizing my choices and loyalty. The psychological manipulation had also evolved with technology. They began using social media to post carefully crafted messages about family loyalty, parental sacrifice, and ungrateful children who abandoned their roots for selfish pursuits. While my name was never mentioned directly, anyone who knew our family situation would understand the target of their passive-aggressive campaign. Extended family members who followed their social media accounts began sending me messages about forgiveness, family reconciliation, and honoring one's parents. My response was to document everything. Every social media post, every message from flying monkeys, every attempt to manipulate my emotions or reputation became evidence in a growing file that Maria was building. We were preparing for a legal battle that we hoped would never come, but that seemed increasingly inevitable given my parents' escalating behavior and apparent financial desperation. The breaking point came in early 2018 when my parents' lawyer, sent a second letter, this one much more aggressive in tone and specific in its demands. They were now claiming that my military education benefits, which had been earned through my own service, should be considered repayment for their investment in my upbringing. They calculated that they had spent approximately $300,000 raising me and that my refusal to acknowledge this debt constituted fraud and theft of family resources. The letter also included a timeline of demands. I needed to begin sending $2,000 monthly to support their retirement, contribute $50,000 toward farm equipment replacement, and commit to returning to Tennessee within 2 years to take over agricultural operations. If I refused these reasonable requests, they were prepared to file a lawsuit for damages related to my breach of family obligations and the emotional distress my abandonment had caused. Reading that letter felt like being transported back to childhood, when their demands had seemed overwhelming and their disappointment had felt like the end of the world. But I was no longer a 5-year-old girl desperate for approval from adults who held absolute power over my life. I was a 34-year-old military officer with advanced legal training, financial independence, and a support network that extended far beyond biological family. Maria's response to the lawyer's letter was a masterpiece of legal precision and barely contained fury. She outlined the complete lack of legal foundation for their claims, detailed the statute of limitations issues that would prevent most of their demands, and politely suggested that continued harassment might constitute extortion under federal law. But she also included a paragraph that would prove prophetic. Should your clients choose to pursue litigation, we are prepared to file counterclaims for labor violations, child exploitation, and damages related to years of financial abuse. The war was escalating, and both sides were preparing their weapons. But I had something my parents didn't: documentation, legal expertise, and the moral clarity that comes from finally understanding the difference between genuine family love and systematic exploitation disguised as obligation. The real battle was just beginning. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, delivered to my quarters at Fort Leavenworth by a process server who looked apologetic about interrupting my morning routine. Caldwell v. Caldwell, filed in Davidson County Circuit Court, Tennessee. My parents were actually doing it. They were suing their own daughter for being ungrateful. The complaint ran 14 pages and read like a fantasy novel written by narcissists who believed their own propaganda about parental sacrifice and filial obligation. According to their lawsuit, I had breached an implied family contract by refusing to support them financially after they had invested over $300,000 in my upbringing and education. They claimed that my military career had been built on the foundation they provided, that my success was directly attributable to the work ethic and values they had instilled, and that my refusal to share the benefits of that success constituted theft of family resources. They were seeking $200,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress, plus $150,000 in punitive damages for my willful abandonment of family obligations. The most outrageous section dealt with what they called anticipated future support. They had calculated that I should provide $2,000 monthly for the next 20 years to fund their retirement, plus additional contributions for medical expenses, home maintenance, and what they euphemistically called quality of life enhancements. According to their arithmetic, I owed them approximately $650,000 in current and future obligations, not including interest and legal fees. Reading their version of our family history was like entering an alternate universe where I had been a beloved daughter who received every advantage and opportunity before selfishly abandoning the people who had sacrificed everything for my success. They described my childhood as idyllic farm life where I learned valuable skills and developed character through meaningful work. My military service was portrayed as an expensive hobby that had distracted me from real responsibilities. My refusal to return home and support them was characterized as inexplicable cruelty toward aging parents who deserved gratitude and care. Maria's Reaction to the lawsuit was a mixture of professional outrage and personal fury that I'd rarely seen in our years of working together. "This is the most ridiculous piece of legal fiction I've ever encountered," she said during our emergency conference call. "But it's also incredibly dangerous because family court judges sometimes have their own biases about children supporting parents. We need to hit back hard and fast with documentation that shows exactly what your childhood actually looked like." The counter-lawsuit we filed 2 weeks later was a tactical nuclear weapon aimed at the heart of their fraudulent narrative. Caldwell v. Caldwell, counter-complaint for labor violations, child exploitation, and damages. Our complaint was 37 pages of meticulously documented evidence covering 18 years of unpaid agricultural labor, systematic violation of child labor laws, and financial exploitation that had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in income for my parents, while I received no compensation beyond basic food and shelter. Maria had worked with labor law specialists to calculate damages using federal minimum wage standards, overtime regulations, and hazard pay provisions that should have applied to much of my childhood work. The numbers were staggering: $847,000 in unpaid wages, plus $312,000 in overtime premiums, plus $89,000 in holiday and hazard pay differentials. Add interest calculated from the years the labor was performed, and penalties for child labor violations, and our counterclaim totaled $1.7 million in actual damages. But the financial calculations were only part of our strategy. We also documented the psychological manipulation, the systematic denial of educational and social opportunities, and the long-term emotional damage caused by treating a child as unpaid farm equipment rather than a developing human being who deserved protection and nurturing. Expert witnesses in child development and family psychology would testify about the lasting effects of economic exploitation disguised as character building. The media attention was immediate and intense. Small-town newspapers love stories about family drama, especially when they involve military heroes and ungrateful parents. The Millfield Gazette ran dueling op-eds about family obligations and parental rights. Local television stations sent reporters to interview neighbors about the Caldwell family dynamics. Social media exploded with opinions about children's duties to their parents and the appropriate boundaries of family financial support. The court of public opinion was split, predictably along generational and ideological lines. Older residents who remembered my parents as successful farmers tended to side with them, viewing my lawsuit as evidence of how military service and college education had corrupted traditional family values. Younger people, especially those who had grown up in agricultural communities, were more sympathetic to my claims about childhood labor exploitation. Several local residents came forward with their own stories about working on the Caldwell farm as teenagers and being treated more fairly than the family daughter. Discovery phase was brutal for both sides. My parents were forced to produce 18 years of farm financial records, tax returns that showed substantial agricultural income during my childhood, and documentation of equipment purchases and property improvements that had been funded by labor I had performed for free. The records painted a clear picture of a profitable agricultural operation that had systematically exploited child labor to maximize profits while minimizing expenses. More damaging to their case was evidence of their social media campaigns against me, documented attempts to use my military service for personal financial gain, and testimony from former hired workers who described my parents' unrealistic expectations and abusive management style. One former employee, Marcus Johnson, testified that my father had explicitly told him that Jennifer used to do the work of 3 grown men for nothing but room and board, so you better be able to keep up or find another job. The deposition process was emotionally exhausting but legally productive. My parents' testimony under oath revealed the depth of their entitlement and their complete inability to understand that adult children have rights independent of parental demands. When asked why they believed I owed them financial support, my mother responded, "Because we raised her. Everything she has came from us. She wouldn't exist without us. so everything she earns belongs to the family. My father's deposition was even more revealing. When asked about my childhood work schedule, he proudly described how I had been trained from an early age to contribute meaningfully to family operations. He seemed genuinely confused by questions about child labor laws and fair compensation, repeatedly stating that family members don't get paid for doing their duty. When confronted with evidence of the farm's profitability during my childhood, he insisted that any money earned was reinvested in Jennifer's future through food, shelter, and valuable life lessons. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court was particularly illuminating. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in family dynamics and childhood trauma, interviewed both sides extensively and reviewed decades of documented interactions. Her report concluded that my parents exhibited narcissistic family patterns characterized by viewing children as extensions of parental identity rather than independent individuals with their own rights and needs. She found evidence of systematic, emotional manipulation designed to maintain financial and psychological control over an adult child. More significantly, Dr. Chen's evaluation documented the long-term psychological effects of my childhood experiences. While I had developed remarkable resilience and achievement motivation, I also exhibited hypervigilance around exploitation, difficulty with intimate relationships, and persistent guilt responses that are consistent with survivors of childhood. Emotional abuse. The report recommended continued therapy and noted that my decision to maintain distance from my parents was psychologically healthy and legally justified. As the trial date approached, settlement discussions became increasingly urgent. The publicity had been devastating for my parents' reputation in their small community, and their legal bills were mounting faster than their declining farm income could cover. Maria received multiple offers from their attorney, each one more desperate than the last. They would drop their lawsuit if I agreed to resume sending money. They would settle for a lump sum payment. They would accept a structured settlement over several years. Our response was consistent: complete dismissal of their claims, public acknowledgement that their lawsuit was frivolous, and payment of our legal fees. We were not interested in compromise or face-saving measures. They had chosen to make this a public legal battle, and we intended to win it decisively. The counter-lawsuit would proceed regardless of what they did with their original claims. The trial lasted 3 days and drew national media attention. Court TV sent cameras. Legal blogs provided daily coverage. Military publications ran stories about the family exploitation of service members. The courtroom was packed with observers who had followed the case through social media and local news coverage. My parents sat at the defendant's table, looking older and more fragile than I remembered, occasionally whispering to their lawyer, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable as evidence mounted against his clients. The verdict was swift and comprehensive. Judge Patricia Morrison dismissed my parents' lawsuit with prejudice, finding that their claims had no basis in law and that the suit appeared to be an attempt to use the legal system to continue a pattern of financial exploitation. She awarded damages on our counterclaim in the amount of $1.2 million, citing egregious violations of child labor protections and systematic exploitation of a minor for financial gain. More importantly, Judge Morrison's written opinion included language that would resonate far beyond our case. Parents do not own their children's labor, achievements, or future earnings. The notion that raising a child creates unlimited financial obligations for that child's entire adult life is inconsistent with American legal principles and harmful to family relationships. While society values respect for parents, that respect cannot be legally mandated through financial coercion. The judgment was front-page news in Tennessee and picked up by national outlets as a landmark case in family law. Legal experts debated the implications for parent-child financial relationships. Social workers praised the recognition of economic exploitation as a form of child abuse. Military advocacy groups highlighted the case as an example of how service members' achievements could be exploited by manipulative family members. My parents declared bankruptcy 6 months later, unable to pay the judgment or maintain their declining agricultural operation. The farm was sold to developers who built a subdivision called Millfield Commons. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the history. The land that had been farmed using my unpaid labor was now providing comfortable homes for families who would never demand that their children sacrifice their futures for parental financial security. The final chapter came when I received a letter from my mother 2 years after the trial. Not a legal document this time, just a handwritten note on floral stationery that looked like something from another era. "Jennifer," it began, "I hope you're satisfied with destroying your family. Your father's health is failing and we have nothing left. I hope your money and your pride keep you warm at night, because you'll never have our love again." I read the letter once and filed it with all the other documentation from our legal battle. There was no anger anymore, no guilt, no desperate need to prove myself worthy of love that had always come with impossible conditions. I was a lieutenant, colonel now, with a distinguished military career and a life built on my own choices rather than their demands. I had found family among my fellow service members, love with partners who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, and peace in knowing that I had finally escaped a system designed to consume my life for someone else's benefit. Sometimes justice isn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. Sometimes it's about stopping the cycle of exploitation and creating legal precedents that protect future victims. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to participate in your own destruction, even when the people demanding your sacrifice call it love. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening to something I never thought I'd be able to share publicly. If you recognize patterns from your own family relationships, know that you're not alone and that you have rights that supersede other people's demands, even when those people are your parents. And if this story helped you understand something about exploitation, boundaries, or the difference between genuine love and conditional manipulation, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to know that escape is possible, justice is achievable, and freedom is worth fighting for, even when the battle is against the people who were supposed to protect you most.